This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern. Every week we bring you conversations with authors about the books and research and other things that we like. And if you like us, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter by going to our homepage. That's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review. Scroll down to the bottom and click the big red button that says Patreon. Click and support us. Some of you have been doing this for months and years, and we cannot thank you enough. This episode is produced in partnership with the Jacob Robinson Institute for the History of Individual and Collective Rights at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. My guest today is a postdoctoral fellow at the Robinson Institute, studying diaspora politics with an emphasis on the Jewish and Israeli case and beyond. He also teaches at the Department of International Relations at the Hebrew University. Dr. Jonathan Grossman, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Hi, good afternoon. What's good?
So your current work makes a theoretical distinction between diaspora and emigrants. Can you explain why a collection of emigrants does not a diaspora make?
Sure. So first, we need to remember that there are many different definitions of diaspora. Diaspora is an essentially contested concept, and scholars love to argue with one another, sometimes really vehemently over the definition of diaspora. But immigrants, generally this concept refers to people who have left their country of origin, their home country, and they live in another country, although they may still have some relationship, some orientation to their old country. But that's it. That's a very broad definition. When we talk about diaspora, and once again, I'll tell you my definition of diaspora, and there are many other definitions, many competing definitions, but diaspora generally refers to a collectivity of immigrants or descendants of immigrants who share some characteristics, some attributes. One of them is the immigration, but they also share some kind of shared identity, a collective identity, and they are oriented to this so-called homeland, this territory that may or may not be a sovereign state. So basically, most scholars who talk about diaspora talk about this kind of a transnational immigrant community that consists of immigrants, but not every immigrant is a diasporan or a diaspora member. There are some immigrants who may not lead a transnational life, who may not feel connection to their country of origin or the ancestral homeland of their forefathers and not be oriented to it, you may say.
So do you see it as an individual choice? Can you elect to be, choose to become a member of a diaspora or opt out?
Well, that's also a big bone of contention for researchers. But yeah, for me, I think that diaspora is much about self-identification, but also, diaspora. You can study diaspora as this sort of transnational communities, but also you can study diaspora as this definition, this social construction, this concept that people, that actors, that leaders in the so-called home state or the host country or the immigrant community or any other people elsewhere attached to people, and they call them diaspora. They try to mobilize them to achieve all kinds of interests and goals.
Mm-hmm. The Israeli case is very interesting, which is the one that you're working on, because
that's why I'm working on it.
Yeah, I'm sure, because in many ways, the one major difference is that the diaspora preceded the state, which I'm assuming is pretty rare.
Yes, it's uncommon, but it's not unique. There have been other diasporas that existed before they had a sovereign state, like the Armenians, or there are some other, the Palestinian diaspora that still don't have a sovereign state, the Kosovar diaspora. So Israel is, it's uncommon, but it's not. There are other diasporas like that.
So is it not a fundamental characteristic of the Israeli diaspora, the fact that they are, in a way, distinct from the Jewish diaspora?
No, I mean there are many countries, many home states or homelands from which there have been many successive waves of immigration, and some of them may have preceded the independence of the state, the sovereignty of the state, and some of them came after. So, for example, Armenia, there are people in the Armenian diaspora who have been hundreds of years outside the territory that today is independent, sovereign Armenia, and they have those. And there are those more newer waves of immigration, more recent immigrants from Armenia, and there are. They both are oriented to Armenia. They both view Armenia as their ancestral ethno-national homeland, but they are very distinct from each other in many respects. Even their language, their dialects, their migration histories and trajectories are all different, and they are so they are two different. You can say they're two different diasporas, but they are oriented to the same country.
Mm-hmm. Would you say that it's also a generational question that newly arrived immigrants, for example, somehow during the years assimilate into the established diaspora? Is there a question of longevity there as well?
Yes, definitely. Diasporas usually are enduring. They are a permanent phenomenon. That's another characteristic that many scholars attribute to diasporas, that they are. It's not that just immigrants who come to this host country and remain there and create their organizations, and then after a generation or two, they dissolve. Some diasporas eventually dissolve, but diaspora is usually several generations long. And so with new immigrants, there can be a number of outcomes. So an immigrant can be assimilated into the general society, the host society, and disconnect from them, from the co-ethnic community, and lose interest in them home state. This happens sometimes. Or she or he can integrate into this old, established, veteran diaspora, or they can become part of a new diaspora, of a new, a totally different, distinct diaspora that may have some interactions, may share some common goals, some interests, some associations, some organizations with them, veteran diaspora. But they also may have their own unique institutions and organizations and language and culture and everything. And sometimes there are more than two diasporas. There are countries like in Yugoslavia, there were at least three waves of immigration, and the Yugoslav state, treated them differently. The old migration, the political migration, and the new labor migration, for example.
And when you look at the attitudes of people in the home country towards immigrants, is it by and large negative?
This really it depends, and it really changes. Like home state attitudes, both the attitudes of the public and of the leadership, the elites, they tend to change in accordance with many factors. And like in many states, initially there is some very negative discourse toward immigrants, toward people who leave, and they are treated, they are discussed, referred to as defectors, as quitters, as losers. But then at some point, and this happens almost in all the cases, those immigrants are being not suddenly. Usually, it's a very gradual process, and this is what happened in Israel. But they are being portrayed as maybe partners, as some kind of extension of the state, and I mean, usually when home state elites begin to talk about immigrants as a diaspora, when they start to use the label diaspora, I mean, this is something positive. This means that they see them as some part of the nation, this imagined community that extends beyond the territory of the nation state.
But it's really interesting. Before we get to analyze more in detail that shift in the attitude in Israel, I wonder about the initial attitude, because clearly in Israel it was a very negative one because of the very fundamental Zionist principle that all Jews belong in Israel, and therefore immigrants not only undermine the gathering of the exiles but not coming here, but actually they're actively moving out and therefore further undermining it. But you're saying that Israel is not unique in this respect.
No, Israel is not unique. There are many countries that, I mean, at first they treated the immigrants very badly. There was one episode, one really funny a statement by, I think it was a Prime Minister of New Zealand, I think, that he was asked about New Zealanders who emigrate to Australia. And he said that the one thing that was good about them is that they raised the average IQ in both countries. So, yeah, that's like killing two birds with one stone. That's something I really liked. And China for many years treated immigrants as deserters. And like many countries do it. And this is not uncommon. Like usually there is some kind of change. Mexico has done it. I think India, almost all the immigration countries at some point. I mean, there are some countries who actually encourage immigration because of because of many reasons, because they have some population overflow and unemployment, and then immigration can be seen as a safety valve to get rid of some surplus immigrants, and then maybe even draw some remittances from those immigrants who work and earn money in other countries. But I mean, I think this is not like in many countries, immigrants were depicted as those losers.
Including in Israel, but as you say, in the general discourse, and you analyze statements by politicians and other influential people.
Yeah, what I call elite discourse.
Elite discourse. There has been a change. Can you tell us where you think it started and thanks to what?
Oh, yes. So this negative discourse toward the Jewish people who emigrated from Israel, and first we need to emphasize that this whole discourse was reserved for Jewish immigrants. Like there always were, and there are non-Jewish immigrants from Israel. They are I'm not sure about their number, but probably something like 15 to 20% of immigrants are non-Jewish, but they are virtually absent from this discourse because they are, even while they are in Israel, they're not seen. They are not seen as part of the nation.
Are they, by the way, Arabs or just not people who are not halachically Jewish?
There are also Arab, Muslim, and Christian Arab Israeli citizens who emigrate, and like there are very few references to them in them.
But these are the 15 to 20% that you're talking about. We're not talking about people who are not halachically Jewish but came to Israel thanks to the law of return.
No, I think they are. I mean, I don't have them. The statistics. I don't think that there are any statistics, and there also almost no research on them. So this is a very like, if one of the listeners want to pick up the glove and
maybe you.
Yeah. But it's it is really interesting. But they are almost absent from this discourse. But regarding Jewish immigrants, and as you said, this was like this negative attitudes toward them, this discourse of desertion and defection. I mean, it actually preceded the state. Even Jewish leaders in them in Palestine, in the Yishuv, in the Jewish community in the Palestine before the establishment of the state, were very negative, very critical toward the Jewish people who chose to leave Israel. and then in the first years, there were even people who left needed to get an exit permit, and the state very actively tried to hinder the departure of people. And I mean, these restrictions were lifted after a few years. I think in the 50s, unless you were a reserve soldier, you were still at the reserve duty, and then you still had to get a permit, I think, until the late 80s or the 90s. But this discourse persisted. And so according to Nir Cohen, who's a geographer from Bar Ilan University who studies Israel's relations with its immigrants, he has a very good article from 2007, and in his periodization, 1977, or we could say the late 70s, was the first time that there were some changes in Israeli discourse. Like before that, Israel was very Israeli elites, Israeli spokespersons, and the media were very critical toward the immigrants. And also in them. In the sources that I read, the immigrants are depicted as immigration is portrayed as some kind of a disease, some kind of a social disease, a problem that needs addressing. Immigrants are portrayed as defectors, deserters, quitters. And for the most famous manifestation of that was Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin's famous statement in 1976 that immigrants were nefolech and nemushot, the fallen among the weaklings, or the leftover of losers, something like that. So it was like denigrating immigrants was the bon ton. And so this continued, I think, until the 80s. But since according to Nir Cohen's excellent research, since the 70s, there were some changes happened in Israeli society. There was the 1973 war that was a shock to the country, and this disenchantment of the public with government. And there was economic neoliberalization and individualization. And there was a great economic crisis. So since then, all of these factors converged, and the outcome was that Israelis started to show more understanding toward the individual decision of people to leave. So immigration was still a social problem; it was still a disease, but the individual immigrant could be understood. I mean, they were treated not as defectors and traitors themselves. I mean, still many politicians talked about them like this, but others started to describe them as those talented individuals who were Zionists, were patriotic, they loved Israel, but they were forced to leave because they couldn't find jobs, they couldn't find employment in their profession, and they couldn't provide for their families, so they were forced to leave. So the problem was not with the people themselves, but with them, with the system, the conditions that the institution that forced them to leave. But once again, this was, I mean, at least in the sources that I read, still many parliament members and bureaucrats and whatnot, they still often use this vocabulary of traitors and sick people and defectors when referring to immigrants, or just very selfish people.
And how did this shift in the discourse? And you're saying it's not a complete shift; there's still this, it's a two-way street in a way. But how did this shift affect the way that Israeli immigrants, perceive themselves? Because when they were subject to this very negative rhetoric, clearly they didn't stand out. They were, it was a source for shame for many of them. And with the change of rhetoric, suddenly are they standing up and are more, say, is it a badge of honor to be a representative of the state of Israel abroad?
So this happened, but way, way later. I mean, at this point, at the 70s and 80s, immigration was still a shame. People still left their home in the middle of the night so that the neighbors won't see them and they didn't tell anyone before. And then it was a source of great shame. So this, I think this started to change, at least according to my research, maybe in the 2000, in the third millennium. But there were some other changes before. So I think, I mean, what I found was that a major change in the discourse began gradually, not at once, but in the late 80s. The late 80s and the early 90s. And one of the main reasons for this, I mean, there were several reasons, and the Israeli economy became stronger, and Israel became more powerful, more self-confident. There was the beginning of the peace talks with the Palestinians. But at least my hypothesis is that a major determinant of this change was the huge wave of immigration into Israel, from especially from the collapsing and then the former Soviet Union, and also from Ethiopia. And then Israel suddenly had to accommodate and to deal with hundreds of thousands of immigrants, and many of them were very skilled immigrants, and many of them couldn't find jobs in Israel and couldn't find housing. There were the challenge of finding housing for them. So emigration, until this moment, like most of the sources that I analyzed were record discussions of parliamentary debate of the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, the Knesset plenary, and the committee for immigration and immigrant absorption and diaspora affairs. So until the late 80s, there were a lot of discussions about them so-called Yerida, descent, them leaving Israel, the departure of Jewish people from Israel, and it was discussed as a national problem, as something that really needs addressing. And then, when this wave of immigration started, it sort of lost urgency. Like now, the most urgent matter was to take care of all those immigrants, and also all this accusation of immigrants as quitters. I mean, it became. It sort of lost its. Those arguments sort of lost their strength when there were so many. Very skilled Jewish immigrants who couldn't find jobs in Israel and had difficulties integrating into the Israeli economy and society and labor market. So it was harder to blame the immigrants.
So you have many of those new immigrants who, after a few years in Israel, become immigrants, gain an Israeli passport and use it to leave the country and go elsewhere. Is that part of this muddied distinction between Jewish and Israeli diasporas? Because, other than the passport and the fact that they spent an X amount of time in Israel, normally not more than a few years, and then go back to the diaspora, does that make them Israeli diaspora or Jewish diaspora, or is this the reason why there's no real distinction between the two?
Yeah, as you say, I mean, there is a distinction, but those people in the middle, I mean, this is really, as you said, it's the distinction is sort of muddy because, like in the records, in the parliamentary records that I read, many Knesset members, parliament members, say that they specifically talk about the Sabras, the Israeli-born immigrants. That they are the real problem. I mean, they don't have any justifications. Like Israel's greatest moral problem was with those immigrants. And it's true, like you said, a large share, and in some years, the majority of immigrants were people who were not born in Israel. But the immigrants that really worry the Israeli elites were those Sabras, those who were born in Israel. And this is something that recurs in the sources that I analyzed.
And other than the rhetoric, it's the Knesset committees, the people with political power and the power to do things, pass laws and enforce them. what policies were evoked in order to control, not just prevent, but also like have some sort of control over the wave of immigrations? For example, I don't know, any sort of administrative policies, for example, registering people or maybe following them, giving any sort of state support, official or unofficial, to Israelis abroad by way, or in order to control the phenomenon somehow?
Well, I mean, of course, Israel is you can say a democratic country, and there's the right to exit that cannot be denied to people. So very early on, as I said, I think in the 50s, Israel stopped blocking the departure of Israelis. Israel, I mean, in this point in the late 70s and the 80s and the 90s, I mean, Israel did try some methods to especially to encourage return migration, to convince the immigrants to return. It was the Israeli discourse back then. I mean, it sort of denied the diaspora, or it saw the diaspora, the emergence of this Israeli diaspora, as a very negative thing. Israeli elites talked about it as a dangerous. One of them, David Levy, who was the Minister of Immigrant Absorption, he said that this diaspora he called it a dangerous absorbing unit, like this community that immigrants who are coming to it was usually the United States. The bulk of Israeli immigrants end up in the U.S. and. So Israelis come to the U.S. and then they already have this diaspora waiting for them, and they can be they both feel comfortable there. They can speak their language. They have their Israeli Hebrew-speaking organizations and newspapers and a radio station, and at some point a television station and shops. And then they feel comfortable, and then they call their relatives and friends from Israel to join them. So this diaspora was seen as a very negative thing. But Israel, I mean, that's the problem with immigrants and diasporas, that states don't have sovereignty in other states usually. So they couldn't do a lot against its diaspora, except for those efforts to convince them to return. So, for example, there were some campaigns of offering some rights and services to returnees, like tax exemptions, custom exemptions. They could bring their car from abroad, or bring some of their some goods, or maybe receive keep. I don't know, import their pensions, or I'm not sure. I mean, this was my research didn't focus on that. I focused mostly on discourse. Mm-hmm. But there were some attempts. They usually weren't successful, and there are many parliamentary debates in which members of parliament are lamenting those campaigns and saying that they're not helpful, and they're actually legitimating immigration, and people they actually make people want to emigrate, because then after spending 5 or 10 years abroad and making money, they can return and then get more economic concessions.
Mm-hmm. I wonder to what extent this shifting in the attitude towards immigrants was done in the shadow of the bigger Jewish diaspora, especially in the United States, that was used by the State of Israel for, I would say, two main purposes. One, of course, it's a source of great financial resources, but also a basis for sort of a political arm of applying political pressure and lobbying on foreign governments. Where did the Israeli immigrants, once they started, the community started consolidating itself and becoming powerful, both financially and politically, how did they position themselves in relation to that matrix?
So this is this this distinction was very important for Israeli policymakers. I mean, at first, one of the main reasons that Israel was so against this creation of the diaspora was that they said that it would discourage Jewish immigration, because you mentioned the two important functions of them, Jewish diaspora in the US and other countries, which is as for political support and financial support. But also a third important function was as a source of Jewish immigration, and Israel was very much interested in those immigrants who were usually affluent and highly skilled, and they would rather that all immigrants would have those skills, and they were more interested in Jewish immigrants from the U.S. or Canada than from immigrants from
Soviet Russia.
Yeah, Soviet Russia, or from Ethiopia, or from and they were like, they saw this at this point, like in the 80s, the 90s. I mean, that was when it began to change. Before that, they were one of the main points of contentions. One of their main arguments against immigrants was that they discourage Jewish immigration, that Jews in the U.S. that see that Jewish people are actually leaving Israel. I mean, this is a great disincentive. They think if those people are leaving Israel and sometimes maybe they're also vocally complaining about Israel, then why should we just ditch all our perfect life here in Los Angeles or New York or Chicago and move to Israel?
Do you think they were right, that it had an effect on the willingness of diaspora Jews to make Aliyah?
I don't know. You know what? I'm not sure. I have no idea, but probably not. I mean, of course, there maybe were some episodic, sporadic cases, but I don't think that this really set a trend. But actually, in fact, Israeli diplomats at that time, in the 70s and 80s, they were actively trying to separate the Israeli and the veteran Jewish diaspora. So we're like. I read a report of some diplomat in Canada, Israeli diplomat, who explicitly told a Jewish leader in Canada that he asked him not to admit Israeli immigrants into the leadership because that's what the diplomat said. We want them in Israel, not here. And the Israeli consulate in New York tried to. Ask the Jewish communities there not to provide Israeli immigrants with special services as Israelis. Some communities were asked not to admit Israelis into senior positions. Israel was really worried about these interactions between those two groups. They feared that this interaction, they would both legitimize the immigrants, make immigration seem like a valid choice, and immigrants would legitimize the immigrants themselves, that people would think that you can be a good Zionist Israeli even if you're not living here, even if you're not sending your children to the IDF, etc. And as a result, that local Jewish people would not want to come to Israel.
It is a distinctive trait of Israel's policy toward its immigrants, right? There is this underlying expectation that one day they would or should all return.
So there was, so until I think the 2000s, even the 2010s, Israel really expected the ideal was that all immigrants would return. Then at some point this changed, and Israel came to accept that not all immigrants would return, and also it's not interested in all the immigrants. Like Israel is not interested that tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of cab drivers from Miami or real estate agents from Los Angeles or movers from New York will come here. Israel wants them IT specialists and from Silicon Valley, and the engineers and brain scientists from Boston.
So maybe then this whole shift is down to the onset of globalization, that the movement of people and of finances is much more common and acceptable in, starting from the 90s onwards. And therefore, this is just Israel's immigration policy adapting itself to this changing reality.
Definitely. And that's what I say in my article. Like, one of the main reasons, like, from the late 90s and the early 2000s on, this so-called diaspora engagement or diaspora governance has become this global norm, this thing that states really were beginning to identify them, the possible benefits that they can gain from contacts, from nurturing and engaging and embracing their diasporas and their emigrants, both as remittances, in the form of remittances, in the form of political support, in the form of knowledge transfers, and also in the form of immigration, of skilled immigration, return migration, or the immigration of children. But also they identified how these diasporas can help from abroad. And states began to develop those diaspora institutions and diaspora-oriented policies, and they started to copy each other. And that is the point, I think, in the around 2011 or 2012, that Israel also started to at least for now, the last stage of Israel's relationship with the Israeli diaspora began when Israel really started to embrace the diaspora and engage it and try to harness it and define it as a partner, and a partner. Like, even if it decides to remain abroad, and especially it was the time that Israel recognized, acknowledged its permanence, acknowledged that Israelis abroad can be partners and friends, even if they would never return, even if they don't mean to return.
How did it affect the relationship of the State of Israel with the non-Israeli diaspora that it had ties that had been in existence for decades before?
So I don't think that it directly influenced Israel's relations with the Jewish diaspora, but Israel's attitude toward this interaction between Israelis and Jews abroad, they profoundly changed. And especially, already in the early 90s, Israeli spokesperson began to declare that this Israeli policy of separating Jewish and Israeli diasporas was bad, that it needs to change, that driving a wedge between those two communities was counterproductive, that the result would be that, Jews will remain Jewish, but that many of the Israeli immigrants will lose their Jewish identity because they didn't have this rich ethnic, religious framework, organizational framework. They didn't have those Sunday schools and the synagogues and all those Jewish organizations, and that if Israelis will not join the organizations of the Jewish community, then eventually, maybe not them, but their children, and if not their children, then their grandchildren, will assimilate into the general society and will be lost to Israel. Israel wouldn't be able to, in the earlier the Israeli elites said that, in the earlier period, in the 80s and 90s, in 2000, Israeli elites were worried that this Israel is assimilating into them, North American society would not return to Israel. Back then, they were still mainly preoccupied about them return migration. Then in the 2010s and the 20s, they're more concerned about them losing their orientation to Israel, their attachment to Israel, their relation to Israel. Like, now they say that they need to remain Jewish and oriented to Israel, even if they would not return.
So in a way, going back to what we discussed in the beginning, that in the last couple of decades, what we've seen is that the Israeli emigrant community has somewhat evolved into a full-fledged diaspora.
Oh, yes. I mean, I think that, even as early as 2004 or 5, I think, some Israeli leaders started to use this term Israeli diaspora, but it was still very rare. But in 2011, the Israeli Ministry of Diaspora Affairs, which is a ministry that was originally intended to treat the Jewish diaspora, the Israeli immigrants weren't in mind when they established this.
Which is separate from the Ministry of Immigration and Immigrant Absorption. It has to be said that these are two separate
exactly.
government ministries. Yeah,
exactly. So the Ministry of Diaspora in 2011, it declared in one immigration committee meeting that they're starting to use the term Israeli diaspora to sort of symbolize this new attitude, new position toward the Israelis, that now Israel sees them as a diaspora. And Israel actually, a year later, one official at the ministry said that he sort of presented the vision of the ministry toward Israelis abroad. And he explicitly said that they had this vision consisting of several steps, and the first step would be to consolidate Israeli abroad into a cohesive community, and then the second step would be to get them closer to the Jewish diaspora, to bring those communities together, so that the Israelis would. I think by then they already believed that it would serve the interest of both communities, would maintain both their Jewishness and their attachment to the state of Israel.
Okay. Dr. Jonathan Grossman, thank you very much for joining us today.
Oh, thank you. That was fun.
And also many thanks to Itai Shelem, the manager of TLV1 Studios, and to the Robinson Institute for their generous support. And now we've got a request, because most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcast app, and we would like to ask you to please consider writing us a review. You too can support us by going to a website and subscribing onto a Patreon campaign. Check out our archive. It has probably close to 1,000 interviews by now. Like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and most important, join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, from us here in Tel Aviv, goodbye.